I've been asked to discuss the prophecy of Daniel 9, in particular with reference to the fixed point for the beginning of the time periods of this prophecy. Daniel 9:24 to 27 gives the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And after giving the initial statement about the 70 weeks, then it goes on to divide it up into different sections. And in dividing it up into different sections, it gives the starting point. And the starting point is given in Daniel 9:25. From the going forth of the word or decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So we want to hone in, we want to define the starting point with that decree for the going forth of the decree or word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem as the starting point for all of the elements of the 70 weeks. What's the importance of this prophecy? The importance of this prophecy is twofold. First, it has to do with the identification of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah of Old Testament prophecy. This is the only prophecy in the Old Testament in which the time when the Messiah was to come is given. And so this is intimately involved with the identification of Jesus of Nazareth as the fulfillment of the Messiah of Old Testament prophecy. Second, Seventh-day Adventists have said this prophecy is also connected with the preceding prophecy of Daniel 8, which is the 2,300 evenings, mornings, and also helps to give a starting point for that prophecy. So we need to look at this prophecy, and it is important for both of these reasons, for the identification of Jesus as the Messiah of Old Testament prophecy, and for the connection with the beginning of the 2,300 days. We'll study that part later, but let's look first to establish this starting point. Now, Jerusalem was in ruins. The Babylonians had destroyed it. The Jews were swept off their land. They were taken into Babylonian captivity. It was the Persian kings, starting with Cyrus, who released them and allowed them to come back to their land and start building. And so we have a series of decrees from Persian kings. And these decrees are recorded in the book of Ezra. So we need to look at these decrees in the book of Ezra. And we're looking especially at Ezra chapter 1, Ezra chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. So Ezra chapter 1 is the decree of Cyrus for the return of the Jews and the rebuilding of the temple. Now in this decree, this is Ezra chapter 1, verse 2. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia. Then it quotes his decree. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. So let every survivor, and so on and so forth. Two elements in this decree, the return of the Jews and the rebuilding of the temple. Doesn't say anything about the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Now that's carried out. Ezra chapter 2 gives the list of the people who went back, about 50,000 people, who went back with Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. And Ezra chapter 3 gives the story of them beginning the reconstruction of the temple. All they got done was the altar in the courtyard. They got that done. And then Ezra chapter 4, opposition from the Samaritans, gets that stopped. So nothing is done on the building of the temple. The building still remains in ruins. Only the sacrifices and the altar are offered in the courtyard, and that's all that's been reconstructed for another 15 years. And so things continued in that abject state of disarray until God sends two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. And he sends Haggai and Zechariah. This is in Ezra chapter 5 now. Now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and in Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak arose and began to rebuild the house of God which is in Jerusalem. And with them were the prophets of God helping them. 15 years has gone by. The prophetic stimulus comes. The governor and the high priest, they get into gear again, and they start to build the temple. Now the western governors of the Persian kings came and found out what they were doing. They said, wait a minute, stop this. You can't do this. And they said, yes, we can do this because we have a decree from Cyrus. And they said, well, we'll check it out. So they take the word back to Darius, who is now Darius the First, Darius the Great, who is now king of Persia. And they say, the Jews in Jerusalem are rebuilding the temple. And they say they have a decree from Cyrus that allows them to do this. Can they do this? And so Darius orders that a search be made in the archives. They find the decree of Cyrus. Darius gives another decree, chapter 6, and with this new decree then, the decree is sent back to the Jews. They may continue and they may construct the temple. And they do so, and the date is given here that they complete the temple construction in the 6th year of Darius. That's 516 BC. So they worked 4 years to get the temple building back up. The second temple. First temple, Solomon's temple, now the second temple, sometimes called Herod's temple because he rebuilt it and modified it some. So we have from 520 BC until 516 BC is the reconstruction of the temple, which fulfills the decree of Cyrus and the decree of Darius. But the city of Jerusalem, around the temple platform, where they now have the new temple, the second temple, is still in ruins. And it has not been rebuilt. Now we come to a new decree of a new Persian king. And the new decree of the new Persian king is Artaxerxes. And this decree is in Ezra chapter 7. And the decree, once again, like the previous ones, is quoted in Aramaic as a royal decree of the Persian kings. And first, Ezra gives his genealogy, showing that he's a priest. And then he tells, verse 7, and there went up also to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king, some of the people of Israel, some of the priests and Levites. And he came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. For on the first day of the 1st month he began to go up from Babylonia, and so forth. Then down in verse 12, 11 and 12, is the decree. This is a copy of the letter which King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, and the decree starts in verse 12. Artaxerxes the king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of God, I now make a decree, and it's a long decree which goes on to verse 26. And it's a far-reaching decree. And in this decree, Ezra is given the power of the death penalty. He is given the power to teach the law of his God even to the non-Jews in the western provinces. He's given far-reaching civil authority. And Ezra interprets that as including. It does not specifically authorize him to rebuild the city. Ezra interprets it as giving him the power and authority to do that. We know that because we have the evidence, the historical evidence, right in the book of Ezra. And this evidence is back in chapter 4. Now let me make a parenthetical remark about the structure of the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra is chronologically arranged. It goes from Cyrus to Darius to Artaxerxes to Ezra and his return and his dealing with the problem of foreign marriages. Ezra chapter 4 is a parenthesis in the middle of this that deals with opposition or persecution of the Jews. Ezra chapter 4 verses 1 to 5 is persecution in the time of Cyrus. Ezra chapter 4 verse 6 is persecution in the time of Ahasuerus. That's Xerxes, and we know of that persecution from the book of Esther. Then comes the persecution, starting with verse 7, in the time of Artaxerxes. So here we have 3 persecutions of the Jews, in the time of Cyrus, in the time of Darius, and in the time of Artaxerxes. Now what happened in the time of Artaxerxes? The western governors write a letter to the king, and they label it. So it doesn't really matter where in the book of Ezra this letter is found. This letter, it was written to Artaxerxes because in verse 11 is the heading of their letter, the letter of the western governors to Artaxerxes. Quoting now, verse 11. This is the copy of the letter that they sent to Artaxerxes the king. We know who it's sent. It's not sent to Darius, not sent to Cyrus. It's sent to Artaxerxes. Your servants, the men of the province of beyond the river, that's everything west of the Euphrates, send greetings, and now be it known to the king that the Jews who have come up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem, and they are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now, and then they warn the king that, look, if you allow this city to be rebuilt, you're going to lose taxes. Because this city was a rebellious city in the past, and the kings lost taxes. So the evidence is that a group of people who came up from Artaxerxes stopped by the western governors on their way to Jerusalem. When they got to Jerusalem, they, the new group that came from Artaxerxes, was the stimulus group for rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. What group is that? We have that group right here with the decree in Ezra 7, with the list of the people who returned with him, Another 7,000 people go back with Ezra. And then they start building on the city. But then they got stopped. They're stopped once again. And so it requires a second order by the king. And this order by the king is now found in the book of Nehemiah. And letters to the king. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes, the same Artaxerxes that Ezra came back. Ezra came back in the 7th year. Nehemiah came 14 years later, and he has news that the city of Jerusalem is still in ruins. It hasn't been fixed up at all. And so he's sad, and the king sees how sad he is, and so he says, what's the problem? And chapter 2, verse 3. I said to the king, let my king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lies waste and its gates have been destroyed with fire? And so he requests, verse 5, that I may rebuild it. And so the king gives him letters to the western governors. The decree is not quoted this time. So we have an official decree in Ezra chapter 7, and we have letters to Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2. And so Nehemiah gets there. He makes the night survey of the walls of the city that are still broken down, and then he organizes the people, and he gets those walls up. So we have 4 decrees here. 2 decrees that have to do with the building of the temple in the time of Cyrus and Darius. 2 decrees that have to do with the building of the city in the time of Artaxerxes, in his 7th year, we're dealing with Ezra, and in his 20th year, dealing with Nehemiah. Ezra gets the building started, but he gets stopped. Nehemiah comes, and he completes the building of the walls, so that now that they have the walls up, they can rebuild the buildings of the city inside the city walls. So here are the decrees. The going forth of the decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. The one that led to that historically was the decree of Ezra chapter 7, and the proof of that is in the letter of the western governors in Ezra chapter 4. So the decree that starts that process, the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, is shown to stem from the decree of Ezra 7 that was given by Artaxerxes to Ezra. And the historical proof of the pudding is in Ezra chapter 4. So the process of the rebuilding of the city gets started with Ezra in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. So we have the decree. We have identified the decree that fits with Daniel 9:25. Now the next question is, what's the date of the decree? 7th year of Artaxerxes. What is the 7th year of Artaxerxes? We know the regnal years of Artaxerxes very well. We know it from 4 or 5 different ancient sources. We have the cuneiform tablets here that have been compiled by Parker and Duberstein. They have the earliest tablet and the latest tablet of all the kings, from the Babylonian kings to the Persian kings to the Seleucid kings. We have those tables, and that identifies the accession year or the death of Xerxes as 465, and Artaxerxes comes to the throne then. Secondly, we have the Elephantine papyri from Egypt, which are double-dated papyri. They have a Semitic date and an Egyptian date. Some of these come from Artaxerxes, some of these come from Darius II, and they were written by a colony of Jews who lived on the island of Elephantine in the southern Nile. They were mercenaries who served in the Persian army, defending the southern border of Egypt against any enemies who might attack from the south. They were in the service of the Persian kings. They write their own documents in Aramaic. And we have these double dates, which also fix the date of the death of Xerxes in 465. Then we have Ptolemy's canon. Ptolemy was an astronomer of Alexandria in the 2nd century AD. He compiled a table of eclipses from 747 BC to his own time, and he dates those eclipses all the way along through the regnal years of the kings. And he dates some of those eclipses in the reign of Artaxerxes. So then we have king lists, which give the number of regnal years of the kings before Artaxerxes and the kings after Artaxerxes. And finally, we have an eclipse text, a very unusual eclipse text because it gives 2 eclipses in 1 year. 2 eclipses in the year 465, in which the text also indicates was when Xerxes was murdered. And that year is 465. So we know when Xerxes died. Now, the Jews and the Babylonians and the Persians had a system called non-accession year reckoning. And so this is the problem of what do you do when you have two kings in 1 year? Who gets that 1 year? When the old king died, King A, he gets that year, and the new king, in the Egyptian system, he gets the rest of that year as year 1. But then you have 2 years for 2 years for 1 calendar year, and that's complicated. So the Jews and the Persians and the Babylonians had year 0, and they called it the accession period. We even have a tablet from Nebuchadnezzar which has marked off his accession period before his first year starts in 604. His accession year was 605 when his father Nabopolassar died. So we know this system and how it worked. And so Xerxes dies in 465. That starts the accession period of Artaxerxes, and his first year comes in 464. And so we need to subtract the 7 years of Artaxerxes from 464. Now if you subtract 7 from 464, you end up with 457. Now some people say 458. If you look at the commentaries on the shelves in a seminary on the book of Ezra, it'll say 458. Why do they say 458? Because they're using the Babylonian spring-to-spring calendar. What's the difference between the Jewish calendar in the fall and the Babylonian calendar, Persian calendar in the spring? The difference is 6 months. It goes like this. The Babylonian Persian calendar starts in the spring, in March or April of our calendar, Nisan of their calendar, and runs to Nisan of the next year. The Jewish calendar for regnal years for kings begins with Tishri, the 7th month of the year, and that runs till Tishri of the 7th month of the next year. And so if you start Artaxerxes' 7th year in the spring of 458, you end up with his 7th year ending in the spring of 457. If you start with the Jewish system, you start with the spring of the fall of 458 running to the fall of 457. It's the Jewish calendar, and the dates are given in Jewish texts, therefore we should use the Jewish year. And I'll give you more evidence for that later, but let me just give you the calendar as it works out. So we're dealing with the Jewish year, which runs from the fall or Tishri or September of 458 to the fall or Tishri of September of 457. We don't have the exact date of Artaxerxes' decree. He probably gave it in the winter. Then in the spring of 457, Ezra begins his return in the 1st month. In the 5th month, or the summer, he arrives in Jerusalem, and they begin the first year of Ezra's construction the next year, following the fall new year of 1 Tishri, or the blowing of trumpets in the fall of 457. So this is the Jewish calendar, and this is the schedule or calendar on which this operates. And that's why we use Jewish dates for this Jewish prophecy. Now, there have been people who have argued, no, we should use the spring calendar. Of course, commentaries commonly use that. But I recently engaged with a discussion with a local church member here who said we should only use the spring calendar for the Jewish dates of the entire Old Testament. I pointed out to him there's a lot of evidence for the Jewish fall-to-fall calendar. I'm going to go through that evidence. It's a little boring, but I'm going to take you through it. It may take a few minutes, but I really want to crystallize on the final text, which is in the book of Nehemiah. But before we get to Nehemiah, let me just quickly run through the evidence for the fall-to-fall Jewish calendar. First of all, the spring calendar was started in Egypt. Exodus 12, God comes to Moses and says, now you make a new calendar and you start it from here. And he measures off Passover from that time. And so that's the new spring calendar. And we sometimes call that the religious calendar because it measures off the religious festivals. Now, the religious festivals, the legislation about the religious festivals is given in Leviticus chapter 23 and again in Numbers chapters 28 and 29. I want you to notice the difference between the spring new year and the fall new year. The spring new year in Leviticus 23 gets no special attention other than it is a new moon. There are 12 new moon festivals, and the spring new year is simply one of those new moon festivals. But the fall new year is known as the Feast of Trumpets, when the trumpets were blown throughout the land to signify the coming of the Day of Atonement and to signify the coming of the Feast of Tabernacles, when all the people were supposed to go up to Jerusalem to dwell in booths for a week. So the emphasis in the festival calendar of the Jews is on the fall New Year, the Feast of Trumpets. Then if you look at the sabbatical years and the Jubilee years, they were measured off according to the fall calendar. And the evidence for this is in Leviticus 25. Let's look at Leviticus 25, where the Jubilee year is measured off from the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is in the fall. This is the legislation in Leviticus 25, starting with verse 8, about the Jubilee year. Then you shall send abroad the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement you shall send abroad the trumpet in all your land, and you shall hallow the land and proclaim liberty through all the land. It shall be a jubilee to you. And so the Jubilee year starts on the Day of Atonement in the fall. Now the same is true of the sabbatical years, and we find that legislation in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 31. This is Moses still talking, still giving the legislation. Deuteronomy 31 verse 10. And Moses commanded, at the end of the 7 years, at the set time of the year of the release, that's the year of Jubilee, at the feast of booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord. So he says the end of the 7 years comes in the fall. So those 7 years are measured off according to a fall calendar. So the fall calendar starts with the Feast of Trumpets on the first day of Tishri. Then comes the Day of Atonement, which starts the Jubilee and the sabbatical years. And then comes the Feast of Booths, in which the people dwell in Jerusalem for the hallowed week. So the importance of the fall New Year is shown in its measuring off of the Jubilee years and the sabbatical years. If you look at the story of the construction of the temple by Solomon, 1 Kings chapter 6 to 8, you will see it gives dates and the month in which they started the construction, the month in which they ended the construction. It says they took 7 years. Now you can plot out those months. I won't do it for you because it's too complicated. But if you plot it out according to a fall calendar, it takes 6.5 years. And if you plot it out according to a spring calendar, it takes 7.5 years. So the question is, to which one does the 7 years of Solomon's construction apply? Now the Jews had a different system for fractions than we do. We would say, well, 50% you go to the, below 50% you go to this number, above 50% you go to the other number. The Jews didn't do their fractions that way. They had what was called inclusive reckoning. Inclusive reckoning means that you take part of a fraction as counting as the whole, whether it's above or below 50%. You can see this nicely in 2 Kings 18, where it says Sennacherib came up against Shalmaneser came up against Samaria in the 4th year of Hezekiah, and he conquered it in the 6th year, which was 3 years, 3 full years. So here's inclusive reckoning. From the 4th year to the 6th year is really only 1 full year and fractions of 2 other years. It's the same with the 3 days and 3 nights that Jesus was in the tomb. He actually was in the tomb part of Friday, all of Sabbath, and then Sunday morning he comes forth from the tomb. So this is inclusive reckoning, and therefore the inclusive reckoning should be used for Solomon's 6 years and 6 months. Makes 7 years. So he uses a fall calendar. In addition, he finishes the temple building on the 8th month. That's 1 Kings 6, verse 38. But he doesn't inaugurate its services until the 7th month of the next year. Now, why didn't he start the services with the 1st month of Nisan right after he finished the temple building? He waits till the 7th month of the next regnal year of his. And they have a 2-week festival. Not 1 week, but 2 weeks, to celebrate the inauguration of that festival. And that 2 weeks covers the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. This is 1 Kings 8, verses 65 to 66. So Solomon waits to inaugurate the temple according to the fall calendar. Now when we come to the divided monarchy, we have all of these dates for all of these kings. the regnal years they reigned, the synchronisms between the two kingdoms. I'm not going to go through all those dates for you, but let me just point out one great fact about those dates. The only way you can work out a well-correlated chronology of the kings of Israel is if one kingdom is using a spring calendar and the other kingdom is using a fall calendar. If they're both using a spring calendar, or if they're both using a fall calendar, the dates in the Book of Kings make no sense whatsoever. You have to use alternate calendars in the two kingdoms to make those dates work out right. Now, which is it? Edwin Thiele wrote a book, Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. It's the widest used chronology of the kings of ancient Israel today. And he held, correctly I think, that the fall calendar was in use in the kingdom of Judah, and the spring calendar was in use in the kingdom of Israel. Now, a new chronology has come out recently from Gershon Galil in 1996 from Israel, and he says it's the other way around, that he wants the fall calendar in Israel and the spring calendar in Judah. Doesn't matter which one you do. The point is, you have to have the fall calendar used in one kingdom, whichever one you choose, and the spring calendar in the other kingdom. So here is clear, explicit, and definite evidence for the use of the fall calendar. And you have to use that fall calendar for the chronology of the kings of Israel to make it work out. Now, the same point is true of the reign of Jehoiakim. He's the king who was reigning when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. And we have the dates for Nebuchadnezzar in the Book of Kings and in his own chronicle. And they're off by 1 year. That is to say, when the biblical date gives the 4th year of Nebuchadnezzar or the 8th year, the chronicle of Nebuchadnezzar will give the 5th year or the 9th year for those same events. Why is this? And the answer, the only way really to reasonably answer that is because Judah is using a fall calendar and Nebuchadnezzar is using, of course, his own native Babylonian spring calendar. And the same is true of the date in Daniel 1:1. Critics like to attack this date. They say this date is all wrong. This date is not wrong. It has Nebuchadnezzar coming up to Jerusalem, conquering it, in the 4th year. I better get the text straight. Let's read Daniel 1:1. It's in the reign of Jehoiakim, and this is when Daniel goes as an exile. So Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. These dates are correct, and they are correct according to biblical principles. Daniel 1:1. In the third, I'm sorry, I said 4th year. That's incorrect. Let me read the text. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. The 3rd year, now we know when Jehoiakim came to the throne, that's in 609, when King Josiah died and King Jehoahaz was carried off to Egypt. Now the only way to make this date fit, and the correct principles, is accession year reckoning, fall to fall calendar. If you do that, the fall to fall calendar, the 1st year of Jehoiakim starts in the fall of 608, and therefore 605, the spring of 605, when Nebuchadnezzar comes up and conquers, falls in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. This date is not incorrect. It is perfectly historically correct if you understand the two principles on which it is based. Accession year reckoning, fall to fall calendar. Daniel 1:1 is correct. The critics are wrong. There's a very interesting, we can do the same thing with the dates in the book of Ezekiel. It's a very complicated study, but it has been done in the Journal of the American Orientalist Society by Freedy and Redford, and that's 1970. And they show how some of those dates work out to the fall to fall calendar. I am convinced that they all work out to a fall to fall calendar, but I'm going to give you just one. Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 1. Very interesting date. Very theologically interesting date. I'll read it as it is in the RSV first. In the 25th year of our exile. Notice he does not use the regnal years of Nebuchadnezzar. He uses the dating according to his own exile. He went into captivity in 597. On the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year that the city was conquered, on that very day the hand of the Lord came upon me. Now when it says the 10th day of the month, the Hebrew text has, on the 10th day of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah means literally the head of the year, the new year. What is the 10th day of the new year? 10th day of the new year in the spring is insignificant. The 10th day of the new year in the fall, which incidentally is Rosh Hashanah in synagogues today. The synagogues celebrate the Rosh Hashanah according to the Tishri or September-October month. The 10th day of Rosh Hashanah, when measured according to the fall calendar, is the Day of Atonement. The vision which Ezekiel was given in Ezekiel 40 to 48, that covers all those 8 chapters, was given on the Day of Atonement. It's a Day of Atonement vision. And what is it about? It's about the restoration of the temple, the restoration of the people, and the restoration of the land. And so on the day when the temple was ritually cleansed in the book of Leviticus, on that day, this is the time when God gave a vision to Ezekiel to show about the cleansing of the temple in terms of its reconstruction, its rebuilding, the ideal temple. So the Day of Atonement vision shows the theological connection between the Day of Atonement and the reconstruction and the cleansing of the temple. It fits theologically according to the fall-to-fall calendar, but is insignificant if used according to the spring-to-spring calendar. So Rosh Hashanah of Ezekiel 40, verse 1, should be used according to the fall-to-fall calendar, and the 10th day is the Day of Atonement. Another indication is the Elephantine papyri. I've mentioned them. They were Jewish mercenary soldiers living in Egypt, working on behalf of the Persian king, and they served the Persian king, but they wrote their own texts in Aramaic and double dated them with a Persian text and their own Semitic date. And the question is, what calendar did they use for that Semitic date? Siegfried Horn, who used to teach archaeology at Andrews University, has studied those dates carefully. He's written a book about it, The Chronology of Ezra 7, and in it he holds, on the basis of texts from the time of Darius II, that the Jews of Elephantine used their own fall-to-fall, Tishri-to-Tishri calendar for those Aramaic texts. But I want to come to what I consider the most important text for Ezra in terms of the Jewish fall-to-fall calendar. And these are the texts which come from Nehemiah chapter 1, chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Nehemiah. These are the letters, the dates of the narratives in which the letters are given to me in Nehemiah to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem. And the date in chapter 1, now it happened in the month of Kislev, that's the 9th month, that's December, that's a winter month. In the 20th year, that's the 20th year of Artaxerxes, as I was in Susa, or Shushan the capital, and he receives another letter from Jerusalem. And the letter has bad news. The city still has not been rebuilt, and he's sad because of it. So when he interviews the king and gets the letters about going back to do the rebuild, chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, first month of the calendar, of the religious calendar, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took the wine up and gave it to the king, and so on and so forth. Notice the date. The date in chapter 1, 9th month of the 20th year. The date in chapter 2, first month of the 20th year. If Nehemiah was using a spring calendar with the first month and its first day, he should have changed the regnal year to year 21. You can only have these dates correct if you use a fall-to-fall calendar, which starts in the 7th month of the 20th year and goes to the 7th month of the 20th year, and then year 21 starts. When you have that kind of a calendar, and they never change the month numbers or they would have introduced calendrical chaos. So here you go from the 9th month to the middle of the first month, and the year number of the king has not changed. Now, critics of these dates admit that these dates point to a fall-to-fall calendar. But they don't believe that Nehemiah used a fall-to-fall calendar. So what do? They amend the text. They change the text. They change the date in chapter 2 to make it year 21, or they change the date in chapter 1 to make it year 19. because they have to have the number changed for the regnal year when you cross the new year of the first day of the first month. But Nehemiah didn't change the date of the regnal year. It's the same 20th year. It can only fit a fall-to-fall calendar year. Now, what does that mean for Ezra? Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries. When Nehemiah got the walls up, they celebrate in Nehemiah chapters 8 and 9 by Ezra reading the law of God. Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries. They worked in the same city of Jerusalem to get the same rebuilding done, and they celebrate the same festival of rebuilding, and Ezra is the one who reads the law of God during that celebration. And so Nehemiah uses a fall-to-fall calendar. Ezra, his contemporary who worked with him, should also use a fall-to-fall calendar. Therefore, the date of Ezra chapter 7, the 7th year of Artaxerxes, should be interpreted according to the fall-to-fall calendar, just like it is in Nehemiah chapter 1 and Nehemiah chapter 2. All right, let's review what we've done. There are three elements here. Which decree starts Daniel 9:25? What is the date of that decree? And what is the calendar according to which that decree should be interpreted? 4 decrees in the book of Ezra. First 2 decrees have to do with the rebuilding of the temple. Second 2 decrees have to do with the rebuilding of the city. The first of those second pair of decrees was given to Ezra. That's when the building started but got stopped. Therefore, that's when we should measure the 490 years of Daniel 9 from. That's the time for the going forth of the decree to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. What year was that? 7th year of Artaxerxes. Xerxes dies in 465. We have 5 ancient lines of evidence for 465 for the death of Xerxes. The first regnal year of Artaxerxes starts the next year, 464. And so now we come to the third question. What calendar should we use for that? The Babylonian, Persian, spring-to-spring calendar, or the Jewish fall-to-fall calendar? I've given you the lines of evidence for the Jewish fall-to-fall calendar, the most important of which is the fall-to-fall calendar used in the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was a contemporary of Ezra, therefore Ezra should have used the fall-to-fall calendar also. 3 lines of evidence. The decrees in the book of Ezra gives us the 3rd decree by Artaxerxes to Ezra, 7th year. The 7th year of Artaxerxes gives us the date, and the Jewish fall-to-fall calendar gives the calendar by which we calculate that date. So what do we have? We have the decree is given during the year, the Jewish year that runs from the fall of 458 to the fall of 457. That starts the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, because that's when the decree went forth for the restoring and rebuilding of Jerusalem. And Ezra carries that out to give the proof of the pudding. In a preceding study, we established the date of 457 BC for the beginning of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. That's based on 3 factors. The decree of Ezra 7, the 7th year of Artaxerxes for that decree, and the Jewish fall-to-fall calendar is applied to that 7th year. So starting from 457 BC, now we're going to work through the prophecy of Daniel 9 to the dates which follow, and then go back into Daniel 8 and establish the dates for the 2300 days. And so as we look through Daniel 9, the date that we come to right in Daniel 9:25 is the date for the coming of the Messiah. From the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem under Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Those weeks add up to 69 weeks. Each week has 7 days. That multiplies out to 483 years. We start with 457 BC. That takes us down to 27 AD. Now, if you do the mathematics, it looks like 26 AD. But remember, there's no 0 year. To go from 1 BC to 1 AD is 1 year, not 2 years. And so that takes us to 27 AD. 27 AD takes us to Messiah the Prince. So what is a Messiah? A Messiah literally is an anointed one. Messiah, Mashiach, the noun comes from Mashach, the verb which means to anoint. Anoint with oil, anoint with water, and so forth. So what is a Messiah? A Messiah is an anointed one. And as we look at Jesus of Nazareth and the beginning of his public ministry, that we see his anointing at the Jordan River by John the Baptist. And so that's when he became the public Messiah. That was the beginning of his public ministry. And that occurred in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, according to Luke 3. Now, when was the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar? Augustus, the preceding Caesar, died in 14 AD. So if you add 15 to that, it makes 29 AD. But 2 years before Augustus died, the Roman Senate voted Tiberius, Augustus' adopted son, as co-ruler of the provinces. So that's 12 AD. And co-ruler of the provinces includes Judea, in which Luke was using his dating. So 12 plus 15 equals 27. So the coming of the Messiah, the public announcement, the anointing of Jesus by John the Baptist, 27 AD, it fits the beginning of his public ministry, according to Luke 3. In the midst of the week, he was cut off. That is to say, he was crucified, he was killed, he was hung on the cross by Roman soldiers. And this has been a little, it might at first seem very simple to calculate, well, when was Passover in AD 30 or 31 or 32 or 33? But there are complicating factors. And the complicating factor was Passover on Thursday night, when Jesus had his meal with the disciples, or on Friday night after he had been laid in the tomb. And so that affects one's calculations for new moon dates. And the other problem is we don't know how the Jews put in the extra month. The Jews had a lunar calendar. 12 lunar months ends up 10 days short of a solar year. So every third year they had to put in an extra month, the 13th month, a second Adar. Now we know how the Babylonians did it because we have it in their tablets, but we don't know how the Jews did it. So we don't know whether the crucifixion of Jesus in that particular year was before or after the intercalation or the insertion of the extra month. So that complicates our calculations. We have used the date of 31 AD for the middle of the 70th week as the time when Jesus was crucified. And all I can say is that there are some authorities that agree with us in our calculations and some who do not. I'm going to read you just one little paragraph about 31 AD from a very eminent scholar who agrees with us on this particular date. Even that, this is a book, Chronos, Kairos, and Christos. It's a chronological studies presented to Jack Finnegan, and it's a fairly recent book about within the last 10 years. It's a compilation of chronological studies about the New Testament. This is page 189. Even that profound scholar of Judaism, Joachim Jeremias, who in his book, The Eucharistic Words of Jesus, has so thoroughly demonstrated to most people's minds that the Last Supper was an actual Passover meal, and has so fully answered the customary objections to this conclusion. Then he goes on to cite the problem with the intercalated month. But he concludes, that is, Beckwith is now evaluating Jeremias' conclusion. He concludes that the only possible year for the Passion in which there is much likelihood that Nisan 14 can have been a Thursday in accordance with the synoptic chronology is AD 31, and only then if it is provided it included an intercalated 13th month, the extra month that year, and the sighting of the new moon was delayed by a day by poor visibility. So here's Jeremias, a very noted New Testament scholar, Jewish scholar, a scholar of Judaism, who agrees with our date of 31. It wouldn't be useful to go into more calculations beyond that, but let me just say that 31 AD fits as the middle of the week and as Jesus' 3.5-year ministry. Then the next date is 34 AD, which is the conclusion, which is the end of the 70th week. For this we use the stoning of Stephen. And the question is, what is so significant about the stoning of Stephen? There are several very highly significant factors in the stoning of Stephen. First is his speech. He gives a long historical speech about how God led the Jews in the past. This is what's known as a prophetic lawsuit speech. It's a technical type of speech given by the Old Testament prophets when they would indict the Jewish people for going astray from the covenant of God. So he functions here as the prophets did in the Old Testament, giving a covenant lawsuit speech to the Jewish leaders. Then they don't like the speech, they don't like his conclusion, so they take him out and stone him. And just before he dies, he looks up into heaven, and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. At that moment, he has a vision. By definition, people who have true visions are prophets. So at this moment, Stephen is a prophet. He gives a prophetic lawsuit speech. He has a prophetic experience, a vision of Jesus, and they stone him. Then there's the replacement of Stephen. And he's standing by, holding their clothes as they stone him. And that man is Saul. And Saul, in the next chapter, is converted on the Damascus Road and takes the place of Stephen, who Saul is now the apostle to the Gentiles. So there's been a transition in an era, the gospel going to the Gentiles. So there are several theological factors that are very, very significant with Stephen. His covenant lawsuit speech, his vision of Jesus, the shutting up of the prophetic voice by stoning of the prophet, and the gospel going to the Gentiles by the man who stood by and watched the whole scene. Now, can we date it? Well, there's no regnal year for Tiberius in this chapter, but you can date it approximately through the career of Paul. Galatians chapter 1, Paul gives his career to argue he's a true apostle. He said, I got my gospel from God, not from the other apostles in Jerusalem. I only went up to Jerusalem twice, once 3 years after my conversion and once 14 years. That's 17 years that he mentions his 2 visits to Jerusalem. And that was written at Corinth in 51 AD, dated by the Gallio inscription, because Paul appeared before Gallio. So if you subtract 17 from 51, you end up with 34 AD. 34 AD as the conversion of Paul. And just before that, in this same year, the stoning of Stephen. So we have the 3 dates, which we come to a conclusion. 27 AD for the messianic announcement, the anointing of Jesus. 31 AD for the crucifixion of Jesus. 34 AD for the termination of the 70 weeks, the termination of the probationary period of the 70 weeks upon the Jewish people, and the gospel goes to the Gentiles. Now the next connection we need to make is with Daniel 8. And we get back to the 2300 days and 1844 here. And we need to notice 2 things. So the connection with between the 2 prophecies. So let's look at Daniel 9 and then look at some features in Daniel 8. The prophecy in Daniel 9 was given under a Persian king, was given about events to occur under a Persian king. And the prophecy in Daniel 8 begins with the Persian ram. So in one case, we have the prophecy that begins with the Persian Empire in general. That's Daniel 8. And in the other case, we have the prophecy begins with a specific date of an event carried out by a Persian king. Now, if you'll notice Daniel 9:23, there is a reference back to the preceding vision. Daniel 9:23, at the beginning of your supplications a word went forth. This is the angel Gabriel speaking to Daniel now. And I have come to tell it to you, to tell you the word. For you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the word, that is to say the word which I bring you now, and understand the vision which you previously received. Daniel 9 is not a vision. It's an oral, didactic prophecy given by Gabriel. But the vision is the preceding vision, the vision of Daniel 8. So he says, the word that I bring you, consider it and understand the vision. Now, in Hebrew, there are 2 words for vision. One is mare, which is the appearance of a being in a vision. And one is hazon, which is a symbolic vision with lots of beasts and symbols and images. To give you a couple of examples, if you look at Daniel 8, verses 1 to 3, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision, a hazon, appeared to me, after that which appeared to me at first. And I saw in the vision the hazon. And when I saw, I was in Susa, and I raised my eyes and I saw the Persian ram. So he's saying, this is a symbolic vision. This is a hazon vision. This is the ram and the goat and the little horn and so on and so forth. Now if you turn over to Daniel 10, Daniel 10, Jesus appears over the river as this great, glorious being, starting with verse 24, Daniel 10:4. I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, and I looked up, and behold, a man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with the gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like appearance like lightning, his flaming torches in his arms and legs, and gleams of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the noise of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, the mare. And those who were with me did not see the vision, the mare, the appearance of the being. Now, why is that important? Because in Daniel 8, there are two sections to the prophecy. The prophecy, the vision part, the hazon part, goes from verse 1 down to verse 12. And then the vision cuts off. And when the vision cuts off, he still sees the little horn, and it's practicing and prospering. But then he hears an audition. And the audition is an interview between two angels. And two angels are talking back and forth. This is the appearance of these angels. And here's the question about how long will these things be? And then the other angel answered, unto 2,300 evenings, mornings, then shall the sanctuary be restored to its rightful state, or cleansed, or however one wishes to translate the verb there. This is the mare appearance of the angels. Daniel 9:23 says, consider the mare vision. Now the linking verse is Daniel 8:26. This is the angel, the interpreting angel talking to Daniel. Now, the vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it pertains to many days hence. What you don't get in the English is there are two Hebrew words used for vision in this one verse. The mare vision of the evenings and the mornings which has been told, notice the explanation, speaking, is true, but seal up the hazon vision, for it pertains to many days hence. So the mare vision, the appearance vision, the appearance of the angels in which they talk, in which they discuss, when will be the end of this vision at the 2,300 evening mornings, that's their appearance. Daniel 9:23 says, consider the mare. Daniel 8:26 says the mare of the evenings and mornings, which takes you straight into Daniel 8:14. You see, Daniel 9 is not a whole explanation of Daniel 8. The time period in Daniel 9 is the explanation for the time period which the angels discuss in their mare appearance vision of Daniel 8:13 and 14. So there's a direct link. Daniel 9:23, mare vision. Daniel 8:26, mare of the evenings, mornings. Daniel 8:14, evenings and mornings, angels appear to tell about that. So the time period and Daniel is connected directly through this. Now the other thing is the word cut off. 70 weeks are cut off upon your people in your holy city, and then it gives the 6 summary things to be accomplished, to finish the vision, so on and so forth. And the question is, should that word be translated to cut or to decree? Many translations translate it decree, because they don't understand the connection between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. The proper translation is cut. How do we know that? Well, this is an unusual word. This word, hatak, to cut, occurs only once in the Old Testament, and that's right here in Daniel 9:24. So where do we go for vocabulary to explain this word? We go to later Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Mishnah. And in Mishnaic Hebrew, this word hatak occurs 9 times. 8 of those 9 times it occurs with a meaning of cut. Only once does it mean decree. It is used, for instance, of cutting an ulcer out of the leg of a sacrificial animal or something like that. 8 of the 9 times it means cut. Once it is used for decree in a midrash or commentary on the book of Esther, where Ahasuerus makes a decree. Now, therefore, the dominant meaning, the root meaning of the word is cut. I have a friend, a colleague, who lives in Romania, who's recently written a PhD thesis on Daniel 7, 8, and 9, and he studied this verb even more carefully. And he's gone into cognate languages. He's gone into cognate languages, not only Semitic languages, but languages of North Africa, Berber and other languages of North Africa. And this is a language study of Hamido-Semitic, where these two, Afro-Asiatic, where these languages overlap. And the word hatak is used in those languages to mean cut also. So the cognate evidence and the later evidence signify this word means cut. Now if it's cut off of something. What is it cut off of? It's cut off of the 2,300 evenings and mornings, which are given in the preceding chapter. So we have the general orientation, Persian period in general, Persian period in particular. We have the connection, the mare appearance, the mare appearance, the mare appearance of the evenings and morning, and the angels make their mare appearance and talk about the evenings and morning. And we have the time period is cut, and we have the time period off of which it is cut. So the connection between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 is direct. Therefore, the date of 457 BC is also used for the beginning of the 2,300 days. And if you measure that off from 457 BC, taking an evening and morning as a day, as it is in Genesis 1, you have 2,300 evening and mornings, or 2,300 days. According to the prophetic apocalyptic rule of a day for a year, that takes you to 1844. Therefore, 1844 is the date established by the connection between Daniel 9 and Daniel 8. And the date of 1844 is established because we have established the date of 457 BC for the beginning of the 70 weeks. And the beginning of the 70 weeks also serves as the beginning of the 2,300 days. Now, just a comment on the evenings and mornings. We know that an evening morning is a day, and that's told us in Genesis. There was evening, there was morning, day 1, there was evening, there was morning, day 2. But it is another kind of a day. It's a sanctuary day. And for this we go to Numbers chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9 is the story of when the Israelites left Sinai and they picked up the tabernacle and they moved on, they marched on. And notice the language. Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. On that day the tabernacle was set up. The cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. And at evening it was over at the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until morning. Evening, morning. Verse 21. And sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning. You see, an evening morning is not just a creation day, but it's a sanctuary day. And it's a sanctuary day because it was a sanctuary day all of the 40 years that the Israelites traveled in the wilderness. You see, when the high priest came out of his tent to determine when it was time to offer the burnt offering at evening and morning, he didn't have to look at the sun to see when the sun crested or when it went under the horizon. He had to look only at the cloud over the tabernacle. And when the cloud over the tabernacle changed from a pillar of cloud to a pillar of fire, it was time to offer the burnt offering. And when it changed from a pillar of fire back to a pillar of cloud, it was time to offer the burnt offering. So the evening mornings of Daniel 8:14 are not just creation days, they are sanctuary days. And so a final point then is about the year-day principle. I've written a chapter in a book on the year-day principle. It's in a book called Selected Studies in Prophetic Interpretation, which is published by the Biblical Research Institute in Washington, D.C. Chapter 2 of that deals with the entire study of the various reasons for the use of the year-day principle in the prophecy. But I just want you to notice something right here in Daniel. Daniel itself teaches the year-day principle. It teaches it in Daniel 9 because it uses the word weeks. Now, evangelicals try to get away from that by saying it's 77s. It's not 77s, it's 70 weeks. The Hebrew word is shavua. The Hebrew word for 7 is sheva. The Hebrew word for weeks is shavua. They're different words vocalized they're the same root, vocalized in a different way. And so it's a technical word for a week, and the week has 7 days, and each one of those 7 days corresponds to one historical year. How do we know that it's more than literal days in Daniel 9? Because for the return of the Jews, the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the city, the coming of the Messiah, you can't get all of that into 70 literal weeks. It has to be apocalyptic time, which is spread out over history by the rule of a day for each of the days in the 70 weeks. Now, in Daniel 8, you'll notice that the time period is evening mornings. But if you go to Daniel 11, Daniel 11 takes the symbols of the ram and the goat and the little horn, and it breaks it down into individual kings that do thus and so and thus and so. So Daniel 11 is the interpretation in detail of Daniel 8. And notice the time period. Time periods are used in Daniel 11. This is Daniel 11:6. And after some years they shall make, excuse me, these are two of the Ptolemy and Seleucid Greek kings. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north. After some years, So the Hebrew word years is used there. And if you look down at verse 8, he shall carry off to Egypt the gods with their molten images and precious vessels, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. And then verse 13, for the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the former, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. 3 times in Daniel 11, it uses the time period of years. Now they're not quantified. It doesn't say 7 years, 5 years, 11 years. But it uses years. In Daniel 8, we have symbolic images for kingdoms, symbolic actions for trampling the stars, and symbolic time, evening, mornings. In Daniel 11, we have literal kings, literal historical actions, attacks between the 2 kings, and literal times. And those literal times are years. So the evening mornings of the Greek goat correspond to the years of the Greek kings in Daniel 11. So the book of Daniel itself teaches the year-day principle. The years of Daniel 11 equal the evenings, mornings of Daniel 8. So we have Ezekiel 4:6 for the year for a day. We have Numbers 14:34. We have Daniel 9, where the year-day principle is required for the weeks of Daniel. And we have it right here in the connection between Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. The year-day principle is correct. The 2,300 evening mornings should be measured according to that year-day principle. And when you start with 457 BC, as we have from Daniel 9, that takes you to 1844 for the cleansing, the restoration, the justification, the vindication of the sanctuary by the judgment of God.